Welcome to On Texas Football. I'm Bobby Burton, your host, joined by CJ Vogel of On Texas Football. It's time for Talkin Ball, sponsored by our friends at LonghornWealth.net and the Longhorn Wealth Management Group. CJ, I thought for Talkin Ball this week, we would go a little deeper on something that we've been talking about off and on for the last month or two, and that's roster construction for Texas then versus now. Exactly what have we seen in the last several months or several years, and how Steve Sarkisian has improved the roster overall over time. And so I thought we'd start with the offense today and talk about what it was like before at different positions and what it's like now. And not only that, but how they were used along the way. So let's start at quarterback. And just start right there. Before Steve Sarkisian came aboard, it was Sam Ehlinger. It was the Sam Ehlinger show. Then he inherited not only Hudson Card, but also Casey Thompson. And it was really those two that started. And then you fast forward to today, and while those are good players and not horrible players or anything like that, you're looking at a quarterback room that's probably considered the best in the country. Or if not one of the best at the very least. Take us through what you see right now from a roster construction standpoint, really a then versus now, because I think it's just so incredibly important and it's so impressive what Texas has done.
Yeah, it's completely flipped on its head, Bobby. I mean, when you talk about this room currently on campus, it's in the conversation for being the best in the entire country, and that's huge. You talk about the guy who has the ball in his hands every single play, controlling the defense. Of course, Quinn Ewers was a 1.0 level quarterback coming out of high school, as was Arch Manning. So it's very unlike what it was back in the day. And, that's not to knock Sam Ehlinger because he's still playing in the NFL, but I think to what he brought to the table is a little bit more limited with his skill set. And of course, Casey Thompson, Hudson Card, talented quarterbacks, both still playing college football all these years later. But I would say not to the level in which we're seeing from Quinn Ewers, and certainly not to the level I think many would have hoped coming into their career at Texas. If you want to go even a year before then, I mean, Cameron Rising's still playing ball, but that quarterback room in its entirety, you just didn't see the pieces string together the way that we're seeing Quinn Ewers put, points on the board for the Texas Longhorns at the moment. So that's where things for me really, really start to shift. Is that quarterback play, you find the consistency. And I know we're still talking about finding that next gear for Quinn Ewers, but we're no longer seeing bad turnovers, balls on the ground. We're no longer seeing errant passes on 1st and 10 and 3rd and, those immediately impactful drives and downs that we saw at the time. That consistency is there, and that level has been raised significantly higher. And as a result, Texas just finished top 3, top 4 in the country a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And CJ, my thought on this is that it's Sark calls it the most important position on the field. There is no position out there that is more striking in its talent level, in my opinion, than the difference. You mentioned Hudson Card, Casey Thompson, those guys, Cam Rising, those guys all starters. Sam Ehlinger even was a starter before Sark got there, right? All good players. Texas has taken even a step up from that, right? Yeah. And I think that there's no more striking difference than that position on a then versus now perspective. The interesting thing, we're going to go next to running backs and talk about them. You look at it, Sark inherited a really good running back room with Bijan Robinson, right? Keontae Ingram is in the pros. Then you also had Roschon Johnson as a backup. How has that morphed over time now? There may not be a Roschon Johnson in that backfield, but he produced Jonathan Brooks. Now he's got Sed Baxter, Trey Wisner, as well as, of course, Jaden Blue. How has that kind of morphed over time? Is that a position where I think there's more depth right now at a high end maybe than what there was, even though obviously Bijan was one of those special players?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you look at that 2021 depth chart a little bit, and you see 4 NFL running backs on that room. I think that was a room in which you look at it and you say, okay, maybe there isn't as much change to what it is today. Of course, maybe a little bit more consistency from Bijan to Keelan. I know Keelan was kind of more of that specialty gadget player during his time at Texas, but when you look at it for the 2024 roster coming up, that bottom end of the depth chart still has a very high ceiling. Jarrett Gibson, Christian Clark, two very highly coveted running backs coming out of high school. Obviously, I think everybody that we've talked to, Bobby, you and I included, have very high hopes for Trey Wisner. So that room was very good back in the day. I think right now you're going to see a little bit more of that high-level consistent play. Of course, with Bijan, Roschon, Jonathan Brooks at the time, you only saw about 15 carries a year with Jonathan Brooks. Of course, he did shine a few times. He had that lengthy 70-yard touchdown against Kansas in year one, but you didn't see it consistently, and for good reason. I mean, Bijan Robinson was the best running back in the country at the time and really helped elevate Texas to a level in which without him, you're probably looking at a year in which Sarkisian's 5 and 7 year is significantly worse. Hard to imagine then, but 1,500 yards, 15 touchdowns for Bijan in 2021. That's a heck of a season. And now I think you're going to continue to see that home run hitting ability with Jaden Blue and that consistency between the tackles with CJ Baxter, with Wisner and the freshman mixed in as well. That level of play will be risen a little bit.
I think it's more evened out. And what I mean by that is with Bijan, it was a superstar, and then you had a guy like Roschon who was just a force mentally, as much as anything. It feels like even if there's not a Bijan in the group, it feels like it's more evened out over years as well. And what I mean by that is Bijan and Roschon were relatively young in 21, right? Then you had the senior or the junior in Keontae Ingram, but there wasn't much in between them. Now you have a junior in Jaden Blue, a sophomore in Cedric Baxter, a sophomore in Trey Wisner, two young guys coming up as well. And so it's more dispersed in consecutive years so that you're not, you lose one of those guys, you're not necessarily losing your entire running game right out of the gate. So it feels a little bit more consistent. All right, before we go to the wide receivers on this then and now, which I think is one of the more eye-opening ones, eye-opening positions, I want to say thank you to our sponsor. Our sponsor is a guy that's been really good to us. His name is John Donovan. John's a proud Texas Ex's Life member. And on top of that, John's wife and all 6 of John's siblings are also UT grads. It explains why John branded his firm Longhorn Wealth and has dedicated his firm to providing total wealth management for Texas alums, employees, family, and friends. John spent more than 30 years serving Longhorns, and he wants to bring his certified financial planning expertise and fiduciary standard to the benefit all OTF members and their families in order to help them achieve their own financial independence. So to receive your free 90-minute consultation to explore how Longhorn Wealth can help you and your family maximize your wealth, minimize your taxes, and secure your own financial future, simply call the Longhorn Wealth team at 972-707-4900 or schedule an appointment online at longhornwealth.net. John says hook 'em. We appreciate him very much. Give him a call. Again, 972-707-4900. All right, wide receiver. This may be the most telling of all positions, CJ. The Longhorns did not have elite talent in Steve Sarkisian's first year. They just didn't. They had lost the Duvernay, Humphrey, Colin Johnson the previous year. They lost some big-time guys. They did add, Sark was able to add Xavier Worthy, who immediately became the #1 receiving threat, his first recruiting class. But after that, it was kind of a list of, I don't know if these guys are ever going to play football beyond college. Now, the roster looks like it's littered with future NFL prospects.
I think 100% you're right, Bobby. And what's interesting is even in 2020 and before then, when Texas would go into the portal to add wide receivers, I mean, you're talking about Tyreek Black, Tyreek Milton, some guys who had experience, had some production at previous D1 schools, but you didn't necessarily see them as instant impact game-changing guys. And I think at the time it was a little bit more difficult to go out there and get someone to, buy into what Texas was as an offensive juggernaut. When you have a quarterback running the ball 150 times a year, it's a little bit more difficult. Now, when you have a top and elite end quarterback like Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning, you can go out and say, hey, Alabama wide receiver 1, come on over. Oregon State wide receiver 1, come on over. It helps in that regard as well. It's funny looking at this 2021 box score, Bobby, for the entire season. It's Xavier Worthy on a mountaintop, and it's everybody else sitting on a little anthill. I mean, there was not much help in that wide receiving room. Of course, Jordan Whittington was around. He was a little bit banged up, only played about 7 or 8 games that first year. Again, going back to kind of the story of his early as a Longhorn, very unfortunate. But you're talking about Marcus Washington as your wide receiver 2 at times. Joshua Moore had, some good moments. I think in 2020, he led the team with 9 touchdowns, but you're expecting more. And I don't think he got along with this staff very well, led to his departure midway through the season. But aside from that, you didn't have really any help. You relied on a lot of tight end help. Kay Brewer, Jared Wiley, we'll talk about them here in a second. But aside from them, it was your running backs out of the backfield, or it was, basically spam the X button on the Xbox controller and find Xavier Worthy somewhere down the field, because that's the only guy who really had that consistency. 62 catches, almost 1,000 yards as a kid straight out of high school. There was no one else over 400 yards for that Texas wide receiving room. It was a one-man show for the entire season.
Yeah, depth, a real issue, and that's what is different today than 3 years ago. Is Texas now has some depth at wide receiver. You mentioned not only did they bring in Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, Silas Bolden from the portal ranks. They brought in Adonai Mitchell a year ago from portal.
Exactly.
As well, and he's already exited the program and headed to the NFL. You look at guys like Jonte Cook now, DeAndre Moore. Then you had a Ryan Wingo that's young. You also have Parker Livingstone that's done some good stuff on top of all these guys. And it's just, again, Sark has done a nice job of expanding the roster from really a 1 to 40 type roster to 1 to 85 roster.
Yes.
And that there is no position on the field more indicative of that than at wide receiver, where before you had 2 or 3 guys that were, you had one guy that was a definite and worthy and 2 or 3 guys that were maybes. Now you have a couple of definites, several maybes, and even guys above and beyond that. And so I feel like Sark has done a nice job of building depth in that room. I say all of that, and we're going to go to tight ends in a second, but I want to skip tight ends and go directly to the offensive line, because nothing has been remade like the offensive line. I'll let you start us off and talk about those guys right now.
Well, I mean, you look at what's on roster currently, and I think Texas could go 3 deep at a few positions and feel pretty good about it. Of course, Kelvin Banks, DJ Campbell, the 2 5-star guys who Texas in their offensive line room, they just didn't have them. They didn't have those caliber of talent guys coming in. Brandon Baker now into that conversation as well. It had been years since Texas had earned a commitment and a signature from a 5-star offensive lineman. And then immediately in 2022, that cycle, Texas comes in and grabs 2 in the matter of a month or 2. So it was really a complete flip of where that room was. And, going back just a little bit, we talked about the inconsistency at quarterback play, Bobby. That largely stemmed from the inconsistency of that offensive line to provide any pocket. Hudson Card gets hurt early. Cason Thompson got hurt, almost every game. He was walking with a limp, and it felt like it was all because of the pressure in front of him. Quinn got hurt a year ago, but that was because he was taking off, making a play on his own. That's not because pressure was coming off and hitting him from left, right, middle, anywhere, and that's kind of where it was. This offensive line now, you feel confident. It's taken that step into the elite category, whereas for the last 15 years almost, it felt like it was a work in progress from a week-to-week basis. You didn't know if your right guard was more suited to be a tackle or vice versa. And I know Denzel Okafor and Tope Amade and some of those guys at the time, they gave you good snaps. But it wasn't to that level that we're seeing right now with a DJ Campbell, a Cam Williams, Kelvin Banks, Jake Majors, Hayden Connor, whatever that group will look like. It's not seen these heights, this level, really since 2009, 2005, when Texas was really winning a lot of ball games.
Well, here's the issues as we talk about them right now. Kyle Flood has created depth, and it started in that very first recruiting class. You talk about it, CJ. They only had 9 scholarship offensive linemen for a spring practice. back when they first got to town. Now you're talking about a room that goes 15 plus, and it's a strong 15 plus, right? I feel like you look at it, and you mentioned the high level prospects, but they also have guys that are on the. I mean, Malik Agbo is being used successfully. I think NATO and Cole Hudson. Cole Hudson's not necessarily pinned to start this year, but he started 13 games in his career. And so they don't just have that frontline guy that's going to be an NFL player. I think they have some guys that are backups right now that are also looking like they're going to cash a check. And, Kyle Flood is to be applauded for that. I don't think there's any doubt about that. This is a team that 3 years ago, I don't think they could block anybody on a consistent basis. And now you're talking about a potential Joe Moore Award winner. No, there's nothing more striking than that.
Bobby, I just wanted to mention, imagine walking into the SEC with the offensive line unit then compared to what it is now. I mean, you're looking at outside of the top 25 rankings. Texas currently has tied for the best win record of any team in the SEC, according to Vegas, with that win line at 10.5. I couldn't imagine what that line would be with that 2020-2021 offensive line going into the SEC conference. It would have been a disaster in large part because of there's no depth. And if you lose one guy, things get really tough. They get really thin really quickly.
You mentioned that, and we were talking about it on Coffee and Football this morning. The Longhorns are going to face some extremely talented defensive lines this year. Not only Michigan with those two defensive tackles they have and the edge rusher, but you look at Georgia. They've got one of the best edge rushers in the country, and Michael Williams. Kentucky has a first-round draft pick at defensive tackle. That Florida has defensive linemen as well. It is interesting when you look at it overall and think about it, just how important the remake of the then versus now on the offensive line is. Because, we can talk about quarterbacks, and they're nice. Believe me, you'd rather talk about quarterbacks than just about any position on the field, because that they can make you go from a B team to an A team pretty quick, or the running backs or the wide receivers. But if you don't have the guys up front, it just ain't getting done.
Right.
Not on a consistent basis. And so of all the remakes, I've said that maybe the depth on at wide receiver has been the biggest, or maybe the quarterback one's been the most striking. I don't know what you say about offensive line, other than I would say this: it's been the most complete. It is the one that you look back and you think, wow, what it was to what it is today, and it's across the board. It's young guys that are looking good, whether it's a Trevor Groosby, Jaden Chapman, Daniel Cruz, Brandon Baker, to the guys that are going to be first-round draft picks like Kelvin Banks. It's the most complete and most thorough remake of the group. All right, let's move on to tight ends real quick, CJ. Obviously, adding Amari Niblack was a key piece this year. Again, compared to what they had coming in, Jared Wiley, you mentioned, was on roster and ended up transferring out. Jatavian Sanders had just come in as a true freshman. Cade Brewer, who just got called up, by the way, a couple weeks ago, back to the NFL. Good for him. It was a fifth-year senior in Brewer and Jared Wiley. Not a horrible group by any stretch. Pretty solid overall. But again, the depth and the playmaking ability may be a little heavier, because that was a young Jared Wiley too.
Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of striking the differences that we're seeing now with the way that they attack play style versus what they inherited. Cade Brewer only averaged about 8.2, 8.3 yards per reception, whereas we saw multiple 40, 50-yard receptions from Jatavian Sanders a year ago, and obviously going out and adding Amari Niblack, who had a 45-yard touchdown scored against Texas a year ago. You understand what their skill sets are. Amari Niblack would have looked like an alien in this room in 2021. And that's just comparatively speaking about the play styles, a guy with 4.5 runs like a deer versus Cade Brewer, who was pretty good as an inline guy, could help you out as that, inline blocking guy, but he wasn't going to make you miss when he caught a pass. He looked like those older days of Jason Witten when he caught the football, just kind of turn, get upfield as much as you can, get your 4 or 5 yards, and we'll head back and get the next play. Now I think you have a little bit more of a higher ceiling with this playmaking room with the tight ends. And I think that stems all the way down as well. We've heard great things about Jordan Washington and what he's done as an early enrollee freshman this spring. Juan Davis still around. It looks like he's now certainly starting to make an impact as well. It took him a little bit. A guy who was a quarterback at Everman out of high school, now fully adapted to this tight end spot. But, of course, Gunnar Helm looking to me like he will be the starter of this room, and he's the one that bridges that running game to the passing game as well. Had some sneaky big plays a year ago, but I think right now that Jared Wiley that you saw in 2021 to what we just saw getting picked in the 4th round to the Chiefs this year, completely different player. He was not a willing blocker. He was not a physical guy on the outside when used as a quick screen guy. And at 6'7", you have to be at the tight end spot. But credit to him for making that turnaround. But he was not the same guy that Sarkisian and Banks and Flood and all them inherited in 2021.
I'll say this, the difference at the tight end position for me, Brewer and Helm are very similar in some ways. Very malleable, can do a little bit of everything, etc. Wiley was just young. So Wiley in some respects is like a Jordan Washington. Mm-hmm. The X factor here is Amari Niblack. I mean, that's just the reality of it. That's the X factor between then and now. And again, Sark going to the portal to make that a reality, not waiting on something else to happen for him. So I feel like, look, when we start talking about how Texas, and this is an important topic, Texas has transformed its roster. It's done it not by just focusing on the elite of the elite. It's done it on a consistent basis, position by position. Each one of these positions, you could argue that of all of them, well, running back may not be in the same great spot. Well, that's because you had a guy that went number 8 overall. Every other position you'd take right now over what it was back then. I mean, just period. And running back, I'm not so sure that they can't suffer an injury better now than they could if Bijan went out back then.
Right.
And so my point being, that's how you build a program. That's how you build something special in what Steve Sarkisian is trying to do right now. All right, I want to say before we have our closing thoughts, I want to say thank you one final time to our sponsor, John Donovan, president of Longhorn Wealth Management Group. As a proud UT alum, John has served for 15 years as a Texas Ex's board member and has focused his firm on serving his fellow UT alums and employees. John's a certified financial planner who has spent more than 30 years providing investment, retirement, insurance, and estate planning services and solutions to Texas Longhorn fans and Longhorns in and across the nation. So to receive your free 90-minute consultation to explore how Longhorn Wealth can help you and your family maximize your wealth, minimize your taxes, and secure your own financial legacy, simply call the Longhorn Wealth team 972-707-4900 or schedule an appointment online, www.longhornwealth.net. Hook 'em from our friend John Donovan at Longhorn Wealth Management. All right, overall, I kind of said my piece there overall, CJ, about what we see from then versus now. As we close out this segment of Talkin Ball, what are your thoughts on what you see right now?
There's significantly more NFL-ready, NFL-caliber players now on this roster than what there was when Sarkisian inherited this roster. And, of course, in large part because of the success that they've had flipping Quinn Ewers and the trajectory that you've seen over multiple years, that attracts more talent. And, of course, Jeff Banks, Kyle Flood, Pete Kwiatkowski, those guys deserve their flowers in the world of recruiting as well. But, when you look back at what that first roster was, Derek Kerstetter, good player, good college player, lengthy career, not a guy that was going to walk into the NFL and become a day 1, day 2 pick. Kelvin Banks, he is. And I think when you start going down, some of the roster, you see that depth speak in terms of what that NFL trajectory looks like today versus then. We just went through it a little bit at the wide receiver spot. It was really Xavier Worthy and, 7 or 8 games of Jordan Whittington versus what we're seeing now, where the conversation is, which of the 6 are going to be in that top 3 rotation. That wasn't the case then, where it was basically if Xavier Worthy's dinged up or hurt, we're going to have troubles getting first downs. And again, the quarterback position, again, Quinn Ewers fighting right now to be one of, if not the top quarterbacks in the entire country. If he goes down, well, what happens? Well, you have a number 1 overall quarterback coming in with Arch Manning and a Mr. Houston MVP offensive player of the year as a true freshman coming in, learning the ropes as well, who also just had a great spring game. That was not the case, despite some good college quarterbacks. I would say that this level of NFL futures is significantly higher than what we saw at Texas in 2020, 2021, and dating all the way back to about 2010, 2012, when there were still some defensive guys getting called early.
Yeah, I've got to be honest. It feels like the cupboard was bare and now the pipeline is flowing.
Yes.
That's kind of the thought process I have is, the feeling I had in 2021 is, boy, it's going to be a long rebuild. And the feeling I have in 2024 is they've rebuilt it. And now it's about getting those extra pieces to fine tune you to have you win 11, 12 games, 13 games, as opposed to fighting to be 500 like they were in 2021 when Steve Sarkisian first got there. All right, that's going to do it for Talkin Ball. We'll do the defense next week or over the weekend, CJ, because I think the defense also has some interesting pieces on a then versus now perspective, because frankly, the defense hasn't necessarily been as dominating or hasn't gotten the publicity necessarily, even with Byron Murphy and Tavondre Sweat going so early in the draft. We'll see what that looks like on a then versus now perspective. All right, for CJ Vogel on Texas Football, I'm Bobby Burton. Thanks for watching Talkin Ball. Hook 'em.